Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video of History Via Podcast. Today I'm joined by Professor John Kloppenborg, and today we're going to be discussing why do scholars believe in Markan priority. Now, if you've been watching my channel for some time, you know I've had scholars on. I've had one that thinks that Luke is first. I've had some, one recently that believe that Matthew is first. He follows a Griesbach theory, talking about Thomas Longstaff. Goes to the Matthew, Luke, Mark order of literary dependency. But today we're going to be discussing why do the majority of scholars accept the two-source theory, which is basically an abbreviated version of the four-source theory. And we're going to be discussing why do they believe in Markan priority, but also I want to discuss why some scholars have problems with it. And I'm talking about variants of Markan priority, like the priority of Ehrman or Proto-Mark. But that's getting into the weeds there, and I'll save that for later in this discussion. So welcome back to the show, John. And why do scholars believe in Markan priority? Tell us.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me, Jacob. Markan priority as a theory comes about in the 19th century, and now I think we would say it's founded on a couple of different foundations. The first is, if you look at the sequence of pericope in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that is, if you numbered each one of the pericope in all those Gospels and then set them up in parallel columns, what you would observe is that there's a good number of places where Matthew, Mark, and Luke agree in sequencing the same stories in the same relative order. There is a number of places where Matthew and Mark agree in sequencing the same stories, where Luke puts an episode or a story or a synoptic unit somewhere else relative to the other two. And similarly, there's a number of places where Mark and Luke agree in sequencing material in the same relative order, where Matthew will put a passage in some other location. Especially towards the beginning of Matthew, there's a good number of disagreements with the Mark-Luke order, and there's a few places where there is a strong agreement of Matthew and Mark together, and Luke will have a story in a somewhat different sequence. What one does not find are places where Matthew and Luke place material in the same relative order where Mark disagrees with the other two, or to put it in other terms, Matthew and Luke don't agree with each other against Mark, or that Mark doesn't have an independent order. Certainly Mark has details that disagree with both of the others, but in sequencing, there are no instances where Mark disagrees with a Matthew-Luke consensus. Now, there's several possible arrangements that follow from this, but I think there's large agreement, and this goes back to B.C. Butler and especially Bill Farmer in his important book on the synoptic problem, that this means that Mark is medial. That is, Mark, you can only account for those sequential data by putting Mark in the middle between Matthew and Luke. Now, there's a number of relationships where Mark is in the middle. In fact, most of the solutions to the synoptic problem that are on the table these days puts Mark in the middle somewhere. So the two document hypothesis puts Mark first, and the other two deriving from Mark. The Farrar hypothesis, which holds that Mark is the first, and that Matthew derives from Mark and Luke derives from both, that also puts Mark in the middle, at least in relationship to the Markan material. And the so-called two gospel hypothesis, or the Griesbach hypothesis, puts Mark in the middle in a different way by having Matthew and Luke as the sources, and then Mark as a conflation of the two. So Mark is in the middle as well there. Now one can, so that's the first kind of foundation of synoptic problem studies. The second is to decide whether, where you compare Matthew and Mark, whether Matthew seems to be secondary to Mark or Mark secondary to Matthew. So if Mark always tends to be secondary to Matthew, then one has one element of the so-called Griesbach or two gospel hypothesis, where Matthew is the early gospel and Mark is derivative. Whereas, say, with the Farrer hypothesis and the two document hypothesis, Mark is prior to Matthew and prior to Luke. And so by comparing closely Matthew and Luke in any particular pericope and Mark to Luke in any particular pericope, one can presumably make some decisions about whether Mark is in general prior to the other two or secondary to the other two. And that's where a whole series of grammatical, syntactical, and other kinds of considerations come into effect. So one of the ways that one would normally decide whether document A is prior to document B is to look to see whether B contains corrections, supplementations, rearrangements to make things smoother and better, and so forth, than in comparison with document A. And that's, in fact, the case when you look at Mark in relationship to Matthew and Mark in relationship to Luke. That is, it's pretty clear that both Matthew and Luke's grammar is better than Mark. So all other things being equal, one would normally assume that Matthew and Luke have improved Mark's grammar. I think it's well known that Mark likes to connect independent clauses with kai, with and, rather than using proper subordinating conjunctions. And that's certainly the case. Mark has a large number of paratactic constructions, that is, where independent clauses are simply joined with an and, whereas both Matthew and Luke will introduce various kinds of grammatical forms to create subordination. That's better Greek. It's very clear that both Matthew and Luke have supplemented Mark. They have, Matthew is at least twice as long as Mark, and Luke is almost twice as long as Mark, with much extra material and with much explanatory material, that is, that supplements what Mark has. There's also a number of places where Mark makes errors, and Matthew and Luke have corrected the errors. So one of the celebrated places is where in Mark, Mark 3, where the healing of the man with the eating grain on the Sabbath. I think that's Mark 2, where Mark declares that, don't you remember that what happened when Abiathar was the high priest and David's men ate the showbread, which is not permitted to do. Now, both Matthew and Luke realized that Abiathar wasn't the high priest at that point, and so they eliminate Mark's mistake. The actual name of the high priest at that time was Ahimelech. Then there's a number of other places where there are factual errors that are in Mark that are no longer in Matthew and Luke. That is, they have been corrected. That's the kind of thing that also happens in manuscript transmission, where a smart scribe will look at the text that he or she is copying, realize that there's a grammatical error or an error of fact in that document, and will correct it. And that happens in manuscript tradition frequently. So on balance, and I have to insist that, that this is an argument from probabilities, that Mark is probably earlier than both Matthew and Luke. We're not at the realm, in the zone of mathematical proof where you can prove that 2 + 2 really does equal 4. We're not there yet, and we will never be. But we're at the stage where you can accumulate a large number of observations of Matthew versus Mark and Luke versus Mark, and in the majority of those cases, it seems more probable that Matthew is correcting Mark, adding to Mark, modifying Mark in ways, and similar that Luke is modifying, correcting, supplementing Mark in various ways. And all of those then lead to the conclusion that, or the probable inference that Mark is prior to both Matthew and Luke. And that's a conclusion that both the two document hypothesis takes and the Farr-Golder hypothesis takes. The disagreement between 2DH, two document hypothesis, and Farr-Golder is the relationship between Luke and Matthew. That is, the two document hypothesis argues that for the most part, Matthew and Luke have edited Mark independently of one another, and haven't seen one another, whereas Farr-Golder think that Luke has edited Mark, but he's also edited Matthew. He's also got Matthew as a source. And once you've done that, then you have no need to posit a Q. So that's sort of the simple story, or the quick and dirty story of why Markan priority, those are the arguments that are typically used for Markan priority.
What about some scholars like the late B. Ward Powers when they point out that, okay, sometimes it's reverse, where Matthew and Luke get something wrong and Mark gets it right? What do you make of situations like that?
Well, you need specific examples where you can actually say that. I mean, one of my, not my direct teacher, but one of my sort of heroes in synoptic studies is Franz Nehring, whose sort of proverb was that, nothing is settled in the abstract. Everything is settled by looking at specific instances where you argue this way or that. But I mean, in general, I would say I actually can't think of any places where Matthew and Luke have something incorrect that Mark has correct. Nothing comes to mind, but there's certainly the opposite cases. But even if one could find a place where supposedly Matthew and Luke have it wrong and Mark corrects it, and where it's clear that it's a correction, that then has to be counterbalanced with a very large number of data that go in the other direction. And so that's why I said a little bit earlier that we are not in the zone where we can come up with a kind of mathematical proof that where a certain hypothesis is proven to be right in mathematical terms. What the kinds of arguments that we have to make are probabilistic arguments that, given the entire complexion of the data, the best solution seems to be this rather than that. So finding one counterexample when you've got hundreds of examples the other direction, that it seems to me logically wrong to try to settle your case on the basis of a single counterexample, if indeed it is one. As I say, I can't think of an example where it's pretty clear that Matthew and Luke have been corrected by Mark, that Mark has eliminated stuff from Matthew and Luke. That's certainly an arguable position, and that's the position that the Griesbach or the two gospel hypotheses take, that Mark has looked at the complexity of both Matthew and Luke and has extracted or abstracted material from it and left out a good deal of material. Well, that's not a matter of correction. That would be a matter of epitomizing. But then you have to come up with a plausible reason for Mark epitomizing Matthew and Luke the particular way that he's done it. And, Bill Farmer and David Peabody and scholars like that, and David Dungan were all ingenious, good scholars who could come up with some kinds of explanations. But at the end of the day, your thesis is only as good as the supplementary explanations that you supply it with to make it a convincing hypothesis. And at least in my view, the explanations that work best most of the time support Markan priority rather than Markan posteriority.
I'd like to discuss the Proto-Mark or Marcus hypotheses. I asked about this somewhat before in previous discussions with you. What do you make of the situation in which you have scholars like Delbert Burkett that say, okay, we have a little problem where Mark has pericope much larger than Matthew and Luke when they copy him. Mark appears to add extra material that Matthew and Luke do not extract from Mark. It's like one can say that there's unique wording. Sometimes he has extra unique detail that's dispersed in fragments throughout his gospel. How is it that Matthew and Luke, independent of one another, seem to evade Mark's unique wording without directly copying each other's wording when they extract from Mark?
Yeah, now we're really into the interesting weeds. So I guess I'd like to preface my comments with a kind of an analogy. In synoptic problem studies, I tell my graduate students that the kinds of explanations that we come up with are kind of back of the envelope thumbnail explanations that shouldn't be confused with how things actually happened. And the analogy that I would use is the difference between the United States of America and a roadmap of the United States of America. A roadmap is a kind of thumbnail sketch of the US, and it shows a lot of interesting details where the interstate highways are and where cities are and so forth, but it omits probably 99.99% of the information about the US. It has to do that because it's a reduction of a large country onto a single page. And no one would confuse a map with the actual US. And similarly, when we come up with explanations of the synoptic problem or the relationship among the synoptics, it's the same kind of thing. The pictures that we draw are maps. They shouldn't be confused with what actually happened because, for one thing, we have no access to what actually happened. We can't teleport ourselves back to Matthew's desk and look at what he had on his table and watch him do his editing process. The only thing we can do is we can look at the data that we've got, namely later manuscripts of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and start to make some guesses about what they've done. Now, the particular problem that you point to, if we want to nuance our sort of simple maps of the synoptic problem a bit, then the first thing I think that we would have to say is that neither Matthew nor Luke has a copy of Mark that Mark wrote. I mean, that is exceedingly implausible. And they certainly don't have the same copy of Mark that Mark produced. What they have are copies of Mark. And between Mark writing the gospel that he wrote and the copies that fell into respectively Matthew's and Luke's hands, there's almost certainly going to be changes and developments. And so I think if all of our synoptic problem hypotheses have to at least keep in mind that we are not painting a picture of what actually happened, or producing a kind of video recording of what happened. We're producing a rather large scale map of what happened that omits all sorts of details. And so a number of scholars, those that you have mentioned, but also I think of Migako Sato, a German scholar, a Japanese scholar who was a student of Ulrich Lutz. He observed that there are a few places where Matthew and Luke agree in wording against Mark, and that you shouldn't. If you take the simplest version of the synoptic problem with Matthew with Mark and Q at the top and Matthew and Luke at the bottom, and then lines intersecting, you shouldn't expect that Matthew and Luke would actually agree in a word or a phrase against what Mark has. They could disagree with Mark's wording or agree with Mark's wording, certainly possible, but that they would both disagree in the same way with Mark's wording. That shouldn't happen. These are called the minor agreements, and depending on you how count them, there's a significant number of minor agreements, and those would include sometimes the common shortening of a Markan passage, example, neither Matthew nor Luke has the story in Mark 8:22-26, where this is where Jesus heals a blind person in two stages, where he touches the man and says, "What do you see?" And the man says, "I see men walking around like trees." And then he touches them again, and now he can see completely. So both Matthew and Luke have eliminated that story. Or you could say, from another point of view, Mark has added a story that Matthew and Luke don't have. Now, so there's a number of ways to deal with data like that. One could say that both Matthew and Luke have looked at that story and say, we don't like it, and independently they have dropped it. In that case, actually, in that particular case, I think that's probably not a bad solution. It's, after all, a story that, rather curiously, Jesus takes 2 tries to heal a person, and that might be a good enough reason for both Matthew and Luke to say, let's not have that story, because surely all of the other stories that they tell about Jesus healing people, he doesn't need 2 tries to do it. So it might be objectionable to them, and therefore they've eliminated it. But it's also conceivable that Mark has added the story, let's say either after the time that the copies that Matthew and Luke used were generated. That is, that there's a second edition of Mark that has extra material, and Matthew and Luke didn't know that second edition. They only knew the first edition. Or one could turn that explanation on its head and say that there was an Ur-Marcus, that is, there was an early version of Mark, and Mark himself, or in the process of the editing and development of Mark's gospel, that story was eliminated, and it's the second Deuteromark that Matthew and Luke both have. But in any case, both of those explanations are willing to imagine, not implausibly, that Mark's gospel was not set in stone, that Mark's gospel itself developed, either got larger in a Deuteromarkan view, or got smaller, started smaller. So both of those are at least logically possible explanations. Now, Sato, when he looked at the number of places where Matthew and Luke have something different than Mark, he made the observation that in all of those cases, they seemed to be post-Markan developments. That is, they seemed uniformly to be elements that clarify Mark, that develop Mark, that expand Mark in little ways, rather than material that Mark would have eliminated. And so that suggested to him that we have let's call it a Mark I version, and then a slightly expanded Mark II version, and that's the Mark that Matthew and Luke used. And that seems to me to be not an improbable solution. That was Sato's way for accounting for a number of those inconveniences to the simple version of the two document hypothesis, because he posited then kind of a secondary Mark, or a Mark II, or a Deuteromarcus, that had a few minor changes, which both Matthew and Luke picked up. Now, that also means that Deuteromarcus was never copied. That is, we don't have any among the various manuscripts of Mark that we have, starting in the 3rd century, we don't have a single one that reflects that Mark II version. We've only got manuscripts of the Mark I version. Now, I suppose you could say that's an inconvenience of that solution, that we don't have any manuscripts of Mark II, but only Mark I. On the other hand, I think I'd reply, we don't have very many manuscripts of Mark in the first place. That is, our earliest gospel manuscripts are not of Mark. They're of John, Matthew, and Luke, about the same time as Mark. But Mark actually is the least copied and the least quoted of any of the 4 gospels. And so the possibility that some versions of Mark went astray and simply were never copied seems to me not all that impossible. So that's a way that adds another level of complexity to our synoptic solutions, where now we've got a Mark I and a Mark II, and Mark II is either slightly longer than Mark I, or it could be shorter than Mark I, depending on whether you think those materials are added to Mark or omitted from an early version of Mark. But I realize that this is complicated, and you almost need a blackboard with diagrams to follow the argument. But one of the interesting bits of data that has shown up recently is Scott G. Brown's analysis of the so-called longer Gospel of Mark, or sometimes called the secret Gospel of Mark, which, according to Clement of Alexandria, or a letter attributed to Clement of Alexandria, this other copy of the Gospel of Mark, which Clement calls the mystical gospel, contained 2 short bits that are not in any of our copies of Mark. But if Brown is right, this could be a little bit of evidence that Clement at least knew of a slightly longer Gospel of Mark. This longer Gospel of Mark has a kind of precursor to the Lazarus story in John 11, where a young man is raised from the dead, a neoniskos. And that neoniskos, of course, appears in our Gospel of Mark, in Mark 14, 51 to 52, where rather unexpectedly, there's a person at the arrest of Jesus called a neoniskos, a young man who is clothed only in a linen tunic, and as he runs away, he loses his cloth and he runs away naked. Now, that's a kind of a peculiar story. And it's pretty clear that neither Matthew nor Luke knew what to do with that. And so they both eliminated. But interestingly, it does fit the Gospel of Mark if Clement is right. And there's this other episode of the healing of the Neoniskos, the young man, and he's dressed in a linen robe. So, maybe Clement of Alexandria is a little bit of is a small witness to a slightly longer version of the Gospel of Mark that he knew about, at least at the end of the 2nd century, beginning of the 3rd century. That otherwise that gospel that version of Mark has disappeared entirely.
What seems more likely to you, that Matthew and Luke copied the same version of Mark, or what's really going on is that, let me rephrase the question. Does it seem more likely to you that Matthew and Luke are copying canonical Mark, or did they have a different version of Mark that canonical Mark is a modification of?
I think it's almost certain, if I can be immodest here, that Matthew and Luke are using different copies of Mark. I mean, it seems to me remarkably unlikely that Mark, wherever it was produced, in Syria, some people think, in Rome, some people think, that both Matthew and Luke somehow or other got a hold of that copy of Mark to make their gospel. That just seems to me exceedingly unlikely. Matthew's gospel perhaps was produced in Syria, in Antioch, but we don't really know where. If Mark's gospel was produced in Rome, how on earth would, there was no interlibrary loan in those days where you couldn't simply write to Rome and say, I'd like a copy of, I'd like not the copy of your gospel, but I'd like the gospel that you've just written. That just couldn't happen. And similarly, Luke is written maybe somewhere in the northeast of the Aegean Sea. So both Matthew and Luke have to be using manuscripts of Mark, that is, copies of Mark that were made from the original Mark. And, if we look at the manuscripts of the New Testament, of which we've got, almost 6,000 in Greek, there's almost not 2 of them that are identical. That is, there's always copyists' mistakes at a minimum, and at a maximum, there's copyists' additions, deletions, places where their eye has skipped over a whole line and they've dropped out a line, or they've added their own comments and so forth. So, if we were in the time period of Xerox machines, one could imagine a copy of Mark that was virtually identical to the one that he wrote. But since, given what we know about ancient scribal technologies, it's exceedingly unlikely that you would have an identical copy of Mark that both Matthew and Luke could use, which means that at a minimum, there's the Mark that Mark wrote, and there's the Mark that Matthew used, and the Mark that Luke used. And they're all going to be different, at least in some small senses, and maybe in bigger senses.
Do you think, based on the data that we have, that Matthew and Luke's copies, respective copies of Mark, they had small differences or major differences from the original? And could those differences, however small or large in number, cause Matthew and Luke to form their own understanding, helped them form their own understanding of Mark, I meant to say?
Yeah, well, this comes back to a kind of theoretical problem that we have to deal with. So, if we assume that Matthew and Luke used a version of Mark that is essentially identical with Mark, then we're obliged to attribute all of the changes that Matthew has effected on Mark and all of the changes that Luke has effected on Mark. We have to attribute those to Matthew and Luke's own editorial decisions. Now, the history of redaction criticism since late 1950s, when redaction criticism came about, has illustrated just how clever our colleagues have been in being able to explain in virtually every single change that Matthew has effected on Mark and that Luke has effected on Mark. And I think that's a tribute to just how learned and how studious many of our colleagues have been. So you look at the commentaries by Heinz Schurmann on the Gospel of Luke and Rudolf Pesch on the Gospel of Mark, but these are both in German. They can explain virtually every change that Matthew and Luke have made on Mark. Now, I don't in principle disagree with these, but I would say that it puts an enormous burden on the exegete to explain every single change. And I think in terms of probabilities, it's just as likely that some of the changes, some of the differences between Matthew and Mark are due not to Matthew as an editor, changing word by word everything, but Matthew inheriting, say, copies of Mark that have already introduced some changes. This takes us back to a kind of Deutero-Marcus hypothesis, or a Mark II hypothesis, that there were subsequent developments of Mark that already moved it in the direction that Matthew and Luke would take it. And how does one? I mean, I think theoretically it's very difficult for us to distinguish between attributing all the changes to Matthew's genius and Luke's genius, or attributing some of those changes to the literary geniuses of Matthew and Luke, but to say that some of the changes already happened in the tradition prior to Matthew and Luke. And I don't see any way of deciding one way or the other. And as I say, when we look at the way in which scribes dealt with their exemplars, that scribes are always making little changes here and there, either by error or deliberately changing things. And if we're going to posit a number of manuscripts between original Mark and Matthew, a number of copies of Mark, then surely each one of those is going to have some minor changes, some improvements, maybe some errors eliminated before it comes into Matthew's hand and comes into Luke's hand. As I say, I just don't see any way that you can decide between those two scenarios. There are a number of places where you look at Matthew as an editor and you can see him doing the same thing at multiple locations. For example, he likes the phrase kingdom of the heavens instead of kingdom of God. So I think it's not difficult to conclude that where you see kingdom of the heavens instead of kingdom of God in Mark, that's Matthew changing. That's Matthew effecting a change. But there are a number of other places where there is a departure from Mark, and maybe it occurs only once in Matthew's gospel. Now, is that Matthew changing it, or is that a change that's already been introduced prior to Matthew, and Matthew simply picks it up? The only way that we could actually decide between those kinds of hypotheses is if we had other copies of Mark or other copies of Matthew that were not quite as edited as the one that we've got. But the chances of that ever happening, I think, are slim to zero. Our earliest bit of Matthew is already from the latter part of the 2nd century, and we don't have a full copy of Matthew until much later. So the likelihood of getting, some sort of snapshots of slightly pre-Matthean bits of Mark or pre-Matthean bits of Matthew, I think, that won't happen. So we're left with admitting that there's a number of ways that we can make our synoptic solutions a little bit more complicated, but no way to decide whether one complication or another complication is the better. We simply don't have enough data to do that.
And what do you think about the changes of the ending in Mark chapter 16? So now we have a longer ending of Mark compared to a shorter ending of Mark. Does it seem that the longer ending of Mark is an attempt at modifying the Gospel of Mark to try to accommodate the resurrection, the differences in the resurrection stories in Matthew and Luke?
Yeah, I think that's pretty clear. Our earliest copies don't have the ending at all. It ends with Mark 16:8, and the women said nothing to anybody, for they were afraid. And I think you can see that when Mark was the only game in town, that is, it's the only gospel that existed, you had to be satisfied with that ending. But as soon as Matthew and Luke and John are available in Christian groups, all of which have resurrection appearance stories, then the Mark's ending at 16:8 seems remarkably unhappy as an ending, because it's clear that if there was a proclamation of Jesus' resurrection and of the empty tomb, it can't be that the women said nothing to anybody, for they were afraid. They have to have said something to somebody, and each of the extra endings in Matthew, Luke, and John resolve that problem, and so do the extra endings of Mark do it by supplying a resurrection appearance story, which makes up for the very curious ending of Mark's gospel itself. But as I say, if Mark were the only gospel that you knew, you would kind of have to live with Mark's ending. But as soon as you've read the other ones, you realize how unsatisfactory Mark 16:8 is an ending of his gospel, because Jesus actually in 14:27, predicts that they will see, I would go before you to Galilee, and there you will see me. Well, Mark's gospel ends without that happening. So you as a reader have to imagine that somehow that happened. The longer ending and the shorter ending, for that matter, that are added in various manuscripts are ways of resolving that problem. Yeah, now they do see him, just as 14:27 predicted that they would.
Would you say that this is a fair example of Markan priority? Because if Mark knew Matthew and Luke and he's conflating material found in them, like the Griesbachians suggest, then he might have had an ending of Mark that looked like the longer ending when he's trying to piece the stories together.
That's one of the arguments that's typically brought up against the Griesbach hypothesis, that sure, in general, it's possible that Mark might have abridged Matthew and Luke to make it shorter, but that he would have abridged the resurrection stories, the appearance stories, seems a little bit hard to swallow, especially when the Markan Jesus predicts that the disciples will see him in Galilee. So how is it then that he would feel okay to drop especially the Matthean and the Johannine endings if he knew them? You run into a kind of a similar problem with the deletion of the infancy stories, because on the two gospel hypotheses, the Griesbach hypothesis, Mark has deleted the infancy stories, not just chosen one or the other, but he's deleted them both. But I think it becomes a really difficult problem to explain why he would have deleted the appearance stories if he knew them. That's a kind of classic argument against Markan posteriority.
What do you make of Mark containing some, not much, but some material from the double tradition, like the Beelzebul pericope and the blaspheming Holy Spirit sins not forgiven thing? Does it seem like that Mark, rather it was through oral tradition or he made contact of a copy of the Q document? Do you think he had some familiarity with the Q tradition?
Yeah, that's a great question too, and it's there's been a lot of scholarship on both sides of this. So one view uh, would hold that Mark and Q, or Mark and the double tradition, are essentially independent of one another, but insofar as they're dealing with the same character, Jesus, and John the Baptist, they sometimes pick up the same story. So you've mentioned the Beelzebul story, the parable of um, the parable of the leaven is another one. There's a 6 or 7 the question about what sign do you do that you do these things, and a warning against false prophets. In chapter 13, the request for a sign is in chapter 8. The I'm sorry, I'd said the parable of the leaven. I meant the parable of the mustard seed. There's a place where Markan tradition overlaps with the Q material. So one solution would be to say, well, they both drawn on the same fund of oral material and textualized it in different ways. And so even though, of course, they sometimes overlap a bit, that overlap does not signal dependence, literary dependence, that Mark knows Q or Q knows Mark. On the other hand, scholars like Burton Mack had argued that Mark knows Q, and that's why Mark has these overlapping traditions, the parable of the mustard seed and the Beelzebul story, and so forth. And the temptation story. Mark has a short version of the temptation story, and Q has a long version of it. So it's this is a place where you have to mount the same kinds of arguments that you do when you're looking at, say, the relationship between Matthew and Luke. I'm sorry, between Mark and Luke, or Mark and Matthew, and ask, is it more probable that Q knows Mark? And if so, are there places where you could see Q improving, expanding, correcting Mark? Or think of it the other way around, are there places where you can argue plausibly that Mark knows Q, and then you have to explain, for example, if Mark knows Q, why doesn't Mark take not just the parable of the mustard seed, but the parable of the leaven, which is also in Q, and which is structured in parallel to it? Or why doesn't Mark take the longer version of the temptation story, and instead of being satisfied with simple two verses of it in Mark 1:12-13? So those are the kinds of issues that you have to face if there is knowledge of Q by Mark, or knowledge of Mark by Q. Then you have to account not only for the similarities, but you have to account for the differences. That is, why isn't there some more Markan material in Q, and why isn't there some more Q material in Mark, if that's the case? As I see things right now, it's we're at a stage where it's pretty hard, at least for me, to come down one way or another on either of those two scenarios. There's and it's precisely because Mark, while Mark might know about the preaching of John the Baptist and know about the temptation story, the request for a sign, it's curious that how little of Q he actually bothers to take over. where Q has material that one might have thought that Mark would have liked. Now, I hope your hearers catch the problem in what I just said, because this is a kind of argument that takes the form of, if I were Mark, I surely would have taken over this bit of Q. Now, I'm not Mark, and there's no way I can get into Mark's head and follow his editorial decisions. So I think we have to be careful about the "if I were Matthew" or "if I were Mark" kind of argument, because we're imagining teleporting ourselves back 20 centuries to a person that we can't possibly know, and we have no access whatsoever to Mark's editorial decisions. All we can look at what he produced and make some inferences about what might be going on in Mark's head. But the kind of "if I were Mark" argument, I don't want to use, because it's that attributes to me far more knowledge than I'll ever have. So as I say, I end up being agnostic on this question of whether Mark knows Q or Q knows Mark.
Does it seem at least that Mark probably got it from oral tradition that is loosely connected to Q in some way, and that would explain how he ended up with that material?
Yeah, that's entirely possible, and that, I think, would take you in the direction of a kind of the independence of Q and Mark, and they both developed their material in certain independent ways. So perhaps they both started with a Beelzebul accusation, and Mark uses that essentially to underscore how benighted the accusers are, the scribes in this case. Whereas Q has decided that it's going to take the accusation and it's going to refute it sentence by sentence. And so Q's refutation of that accusation is much more complicated and much more attentive to various kinds of argumentative or logical moves. So you could certainly imagine that they both start with the same oral story of Jesus being accused of this and have moved it in two quite different directions for their own editorial purposes.
Oh, and my closing question, why do you think that Matthew and Luke independently decide to shorten many of the Markan pericopes?
Some of them, the one that I mentioned in Mark 8:22-26, this is the two-stage healing. I would think that the easiest explanation there is that it's such an anomalous miracle story that implies that Jesus needs 2 tries to heal a person. So that becomes a kind of theological problem. A second passage that has been eliminated is Mark 3:20-21. Neither Matthew nor Luke has it, and that's the story where some paraiezus, some associated with Jesus, his way of saying his family, went out to grab him because they said he was crazy, he's out of his mind. Now, the normal way of reading Mark 3:20-21 is that it's a comment on Jesus' family, who thinks he's crazy, and then tries to interrupt him by grabbing him. It doesn't happen, because the very next thing that happens is the Beelzebul accusation happens in Mark in 3:22, and then Jesus responds to that. Now, neither Matthew nor Luke can take over Mark 3:20-21, because both of them have already signaled, especially in the infancy stories, that Jesus' family knows exactly who he is. They know that he's not crazy. Matthew's gospel has already explained at pretty great length that Joseph has already been apprised of who Jesus is by the angel, and Luke's gospel has similarly spent a good amount of time explaining that Mary knows exactly who Jesus is because Mary has been told, and has, there's all sorts of empirical evidence in both Matthew and Luke's infancy stories that indicate that Jesus' parents were perfectly aware of who he was because they saw the kinds of things that he did. So Mark 3:20 to 21 is a kind of red flag for both of them. They have to eliminate it because it so frontally interferes with the way they've constructed Jesus from the infancy stories. So there are places like that where it's some of the material is eliminated because, in the case of the two-stage miracle, it's a kind of anomalous thing to do. And in the case of Mark 3:20 to 21, neither of them can retain it because it actually violates or it contradicts the way they've already constructed Jesus' family. There are a few other places where Matthew and Luke have both in tandem shortened Markan bit. Let me see if I can think of a good example of that. In the story of the Great Commandment, there's some shortening of Mark that's happened. And I think there it's simply because Matthew and Luke see what Mark has as redundant. There are certainly a number of places where Mark has redundant sentences. So one of them would be, it's Mark 1, is it 32, where he begins that evening when the sun was going down. Well, what other time of the day does the sun go down but evening? Mark has a number of these redundant sentences, and it's pretty frequent for Matthew and Luke to take only one half of that redundant expression. Sometimes Matthew takes one half, Luke takes the other half. Sometimes they take both the same half and dump and eliminate the other half. So that's an issue. That's, I think, a stylistic issue. You don't need to say things twice if you can say them once. And so those redundant expressions, they tend to get weeded out of Mark precisely because they're redundant. You don't need to say them twice. So there's a number of reasons that where you can explain why some shortening of Mark has taken place. The seed growing secretly is also a parable that neither Matthew nor Luke has. And I think in that case, that's because Matthew and Luke have a number of other seeds parables that make whatever point the seed growing secretly does in Mark and make it even better. So when you get material that either is redundant or is supplanted by better illustrations, then you can eliminate some of those materials.
Well, thank you for joining me today, John.
Thank you very much, Jacob. It's good to talk to you as always.
Hello, viewers. Thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and/or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during the live stream. Thank you.